Buddhism, Hearing Her Words. And as Graham said, the topic of women in Buddhism has been a topic that I've been researching for about 20 years, since the time of my PhD. And I have written a lot of books and articles about it. Now, this talk will be based on one of my most recent books, I Hear Her Words, An Introduction to Women in Buddhism. This book was published in 2021 by Windhorse Publications, which is the publishing arm of the Triratna Buddhist community. So this book is written with practitioners in mind. The Triratna Buddhist community approached me and asked me to write this book. And initially I said no, and it took them 2 years to convince me to write it. And in that intervening time, I had some experience of the Triratna Buddhist community, so of a practitioner community. And they were using books on women in Buddhism from the 1980s and 90s, which were very outdated. So I could see actually that an introductory book written with practitioners in mind would be a good contribution. So hence I did write it. When it was published, I did do 2 talks on the book, which are online. And those covered part 1 of the book. And today I'm going to focus more on part 2 of the book. So part 1 of the book looks at Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist ethics and questions of gender. And one of the central arguments in part 1 of the book is that to say women are inferior to men is undoctrinal according to Buddhist ethics. Now, if one looks at Buddhist texts and reviews what Buddhist texts say about women, quite often the same sort of things keep coming into the text, which I would say come in through acculturation. So women might be called jealous or manipulative or deceitful. So my argument in this section of the book is that to say things like that is essentially undoctrinal if you think about the doctrine of dependent arising. And I'll read just 2 short extracts from this part of the book because to give you an indication of what I talk about in part 1 of the book. So to judge a woman as inferior to a man because of her female nature is undoctrinal according to dependent arising. Negative characteristics of women identified in chapter 2, that is, characteristics that we find in Buddhist texts, that women are weak, vile, debased, detestable, devious, cruel, lacking intelligence. These are aspects of human nature. Human nature is, according to the teachings of dependent arising, causally conditioned. It is subject to constant change. Therefore, if a person is cruel or devious, their cruelty or deviousness is causally conditioned. Their cruelty or deviousness has arisen, come into being, as a result of a certain set of circumstances or conditions. There will always be reasons why a person exhibits cruelty towards others, and those reasons, like all things, are subject to change. Once these reasons change, once the conditions that have caused the cruelty to arise cease to exist, then the cruelty ceases to exist. To say that women are inferior to men because of their nature contradicts basic Buddhist doctrines. At its heart, Buddhism is a religion concerned with human transformation. The attainment of awakening and the realization of nirvana are possible only because the transformation of human nature into something other and better from a Buddhist point of view is possible. The transformation can only be conceived of and achieved because of the nature of sentient beings and the nature of the world. Both of these are malleable and adaptable, constantly in flux and ever-changing. Hence, an allegation that women's deleterious nature is fixed, static, and unchanging flies in the face of everything that Buddhism teaches. So that just gives you a brief introduction to part 1 of the book. And as I've said, I've given 2 online talks about that, so I won't be focusing on that today. But Graham, if you could put into the chat the link that I sent you earlier, if you're interested in hearing those talks, if you click on the link that Graham's going to put into the chat, you can find links to those talks, and also on that page, some of my other academic work that I'm going to refer to as I'm talking. So in the second part of the book, I concentrate on the lives of women in Buddhist history. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that what has happened in scholarship in Buddhism, and this tends to happen or has happened in scholarship in relation to other religious traditions as well, is in the 70s and the 80s when second wave feminists were writing about women in Buddhism, they tended to concentrate on many of these negative passages that I've just mentioned. And so what happens was that many words were written about these negative passages, and the content of them was repeated and repeated and repeated. A kind of unfortunate consequence, actually, of attempts to address issues. So what I argue in the book is that we are in a position now, after decades of excellent scholarship, in that we can begin to center the lives of women in the history of Buddhism and women living today. We can focus on their lives, we can center those, and we can concentrate more on examples of women as inspiring teachers and esteemed leaders in the tradition. So that what we might have had, or might still have, when a professor or a Buddhist teacher is asked in a class, what about women in Buddhism? They might reply, well, there's a lot of negativity in Buddhist texts about women, issues in Buddhist traditions, especially concerning female ordination. I will say at this point, I'm no expert on female ordination. There are very many scholars who work on it who are better equipped to talk about that than me. And what I argue for is that as well as that, we can now start to center the lives of women in Buddhist history. Now, I can't see all of this quote, which I was going to read out because all of your faces are down one side of it. I did print it out here, but it's very small. It's very small. Okay, let's see. So there's a long history of women in Buddhism from the time of the first nuns who are direct disciples of the Buddha up until the present day. Women have been and continue to be esteemed teachers, inspiring leaders, and devoted disciples. Women in the history of Buddhism have begun new traditions, introduced new teachings or new interpretations of teachings, gained new converts, organized, funded, and built new temples, monasteries, and nunneries, been instrumental in taking Buddhism to new shores, created new literary works, other works of art, funded the works of teachers, and engaged in compassionate outreach and socially engaged projects. Without the contributions of these many women, Buddhism would not be what it is today. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about lives of Buddhist women throughout history. But just before doing that, I'm going to talk about two recent publications. As I say, this shift that I want to make is something that I'm talking about in my book. But actually, sadly, we can see from other books that have been recently published, there still is a way to go with fully establishing work in this area. So the first of these is Brill's Encyclopedia of Buddhism. And as you can see, this is a hefty tome. It's 1,294 pages. So as you can see from the slide, this is volume 2 and it's about lives of Buddhists. So most of it is about lives of Buddhist teachers, but it does include sections on lives of Buddhas and lives of Bodhisattvas. Now, I'm just in the middle of researching this more thoroughly to write a review essay on it. But as far as I can see, in the 1,294 pages, there's only 11 pages that talk about named female teachers. So, and it's a shame actually, because there's a huge amount of really excellent scholarship that's gone into this book. And it's quite a surprise to me that nobody in the whole process, the editors, none of the publishers at Brill, who's an excellent publisher, would have noticed this and rectified it. The second book, I've already written a 12-page review essay on, and that again you can find if you click the link that Graham put into the chat. So Jose Cabezon's book, Sexuality in Classical South Asian Buddhism, this was published in 2017. Now this book is, my review is called An Uneven Landscape, because in terms of, so the main themes in the book are sex and sexuality. And on those themes, Jose Cabezon does a really excellent job. But unfortunately, when he talks about gender, which he says himself isn't the main focus of the book, but necessary as part of the book to talk about sex and sexuality, he does reproduce this idea that Buddhism is on the whole negative about women. Which again, it's a great shame that books are still being published on that, with my work and the work of many other scholars like me trying to, change the debate, move forward the debate. So, okay then, as I say, the rest of the talks are going to be about Buddhist women in the history of Buddhism. So these early Buddhist women who we know of from Buddhist canons and other Buddhist work, these women are quite well known. So images I have here are from Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Thailand, New Mexico in the USA, and Taiwan. And the picture of the temple is a Burmese temple, which has a label inscription on the wall that says, these are paintings of Upalavana and Kisagotami. Now, the paintings aren't there anymore, but the label inscription shows us that in the medieval period, these Buddhist women from the early texts were known of in Burma. So these women are celebrated in Buddhist tradition, still known of today, and their stories have been told and repeated as we hear about them. We hear about their biographies in Buddhist canons and related literature. But actually, after the point of these women, many of the women who have contributed to Buddhism and made it what it is today are not well known like these women are. So before I go on to talk about some of those, this image from a temple mural in Thailand, which has Dharmadinna in conversation with the other early Buddhist nuns. This image also reminded me of something else in the tradition, which I wanted to say before I go on to talk about women in the tradition. As you can see, Dharmadinna is to the side of the painting, there in conversation with the other Buddhist nuns. And then in the center of the painting is a grey building with a nun in the window. Now, I don't know who painted this, but it looks to me as if it might even have been the case that the artist painted it. The grey building looked too central. He decided, I think I'll put a nun in the window there. And what that woman reminded me of, that picture of that nun there reminded me of, is we all know these types of people who are the quiet ones, the thoughtful ones, who might wander off when there's some teaching going on, observing, looking, thinking on their own. This image of that woman just reminded me of people like that in the community. And what I wanted to say is, I'm sure there are lots of other Buddhist women in the history of Buddhism who might have been like this, the quiet ones, the ones who have meditated a lot, the ones who have thought a lot and practiced a lot, whose names we will never know. So I'm going to talk about some women whose names we do know, stories we do know something about, but there'll be a lot of other women that contributed as well, whose names will be lost to us and we'll never know. So Sanchi inscriptions. So these inscriptions, these are part of a body of early inscriptions dating from around about 200 BCE to say 500 CE. So in these inscriptions, we also find the names of other Buddhist women, so Buddhist nuns and their teachers. And this is an excellent example of one. So the gift of what would be Sangharakkhita in Pali, the gift of Sangharakkhita, female pupil of Yasila. So this is what we typically find on these inscriptions, the name of a nun who made the inscription and them talking about themselves, describing themselves in relation to their female teacher. So as I say, these are the first group of women, ones that I have worked on that are not well known in the Buddhist tradition today in the same way that these earliest Buddhist nuns are that we find in the Buddhist canon. So my publication that I've got there, details of at the bottom of the screen. This is about these inscriptions. And one of the things I argue that these inscriptions show us is that there's a possibility that early Buddhist communities were not segregated along the lines of gender. So as well as inscriptions, which are inscriptions by Buddhist women or nuns talking about themselves as having a female teacher, we also find, for example, inscriptions which might be a donation made by both a monk and a nun talking about themselves as disciples of the same teacher. So the inscriptions show us that Buddhist monks at this time would have had male and female disciples. So in this article that I've given you a reference to here, I've argued that this and other corroborating evidence, some of which is in Pali texts themselves, suggests to us that the early community wasn't fully segregated along gender lines. Okay, so next one. So Amal mentioned Sanghamitra, and Sanghamitra is someone that many of you know of. But the Sri Lankan Chronicles, I don't know how many of you know about these Devamsas, as well as Sanghamitra. There are quite a lot of other Buddhist nuns and Buddhist women who are mentioned in these Sri Lankan chronicles. So in the Deepavamsa, we have a list of both Sri Lankan and Indian nuns. Within this list, we have both the women from the Buddhist canon that we know of already, said to have come to Sri Lanka or said to have ordained Sri Lankan women. And the Sri Lankan women, some of these Sri Lankan nuns are named. We understand them, I think, to be some of the first Buddhist nuns in Sri Lanka. And what the text says about these women, they were learned and virtuous, preservers of tradition. They understand the true religion, but they have firmly grounded faith, teachers of many, I think hundreds of thousands might be mentioned, passionless and tranquil and resolute. So next, then, we move to 12th century Cambodia. And here we have an inscription written by Indra Devi about her sister Jayaraja Devi. So this is an inscription. We have a couple of inscriptions from the Angkor region, not on Angkor Wat itself, but from other buildings and monuments around. And what Indra Devi says about her sister is that she was devoted to the Buddha. She set up convents for girls and she taught Buddhist teachings to many. So I'll read out a little bit of her inscription. I think I saw Ashley Thompson in the audience. I'm reading Ashley Thompson's translation, if I did see her in the audience. So Indra Devi says about her sister. She was beholding the Buddha as the beloved to be attained. She walked the calm path of Sugata, which passes between the fire of torment and sea of suffering. She worshipped the Buddha, desiring emancipation, following his path. Her good deeds accomplished, her conduct prescribed by tradition, and engendered of her acquired merits, and her glory resplendent throughout the world. Having adopted by the hundreds hosts of young girls, injured and abandoned by their mothers, as if they were her own, she raised them in a village called Dharmakirti, renowned for its Dharma, rich in happiness and wealth. In this way, she brought into the religion with clothing, gifts, and prescribed ritual, the village of Dharmakirti, transformed with its established boundaries, famed for its religious teachings, forever maintaining the honor of Dharma. Okay, so moving now on to, I think we're in the 15th century now, just checking. Yeah, so 15th century Tibetan Buddhism, so Chokyi Drongma. So in Tibetan Buddhism, we have a particular type of reincarnation lineage, which is, although we have the idea of reincarnation and rebirth in many Buddhist traditions, the way that it works in Tibetan Buddhism is particular to Tibetan Buddhism, whereby the consciousness of one person is transferred to another person. So I presume you all know about reincarnation lineages, and particularly that of the Dalai Lama. So Chokyi Drongma's reincarnation lineage is as old as that of the Dalai Lama. So it begins in the 15th century and continues up until the present day. So Chokyi Drongma was a royal woman who decided that she wanted to ordain and become a nun. And it took her many attempts to fulfill her desire. What we see in many of these stories of women from history is that their family, their husbands, often try to stop them. If they decide they want to ordain, they want to renounce the world, they want to become a Buddhist nun, there are often attempts to stop them by their family. The biography of Chokyi Drongma, which I think was written just a short time after her death, says that when it was known that she wanted to be a Buddhist nun, guards and dogs were placed at every entrance of the palace to stop her leaving. So she does eventually persuade her husband, and he does allow her to ordain and become a Buddhist nun. And then after her passing away, her disciples go around and look for the reincarnation of her. And as I say, this reincarnation is something that continues till today. So this is other women in this reincarnation lineage. And we have here the second one. So when her disciples go and try and find the reincarnation, this image is thought to be the second one. And then we have as well here the 11th woman in the lineage and the 12th woman in the lineage. So as I say, it's a long ordination lineage, well-known one. Okay, so moving on to Japan. So we've seen Buddhist leaders, Buddhist teachers, we've seen reincarnation lineages, and we also have poets, women writing literature, artists, activists, etc. So Chio Nui was a female haiku master, as well known in her time as Basho. Unfortunately, haiku masters who followed on from Chio Nui did not like her work, and she kind of fell out of favor, and knowledge of her was to some extent lost, even though she composed 1,700 haiku in her life. But thankfully that has changed now, and the central image is an image of a statue of her outside a museum dedicated to her near her hometown in Japan. So Chio Nui didn't ordain as a Buddhist until her 50s, although she was writing haiku before that. And I will read out a few of her haiku. So in haiku, which is, I'm sure, a form of poetry that many of you are familiar with, haiku can generally talk about themes that are similar to Buddhism, like the theme of impermanence, for instance. So this is 3 of her haiku on impermanence. Faces of a dream, a butterfly through the flower field. Clear water is cool. Fireflies vanish. There's nothing more. Among a field of horsetail weeds, temple ruins. Chio Nui did in her life as well talk about issues to do with women, and she wrote 41 of her haiku are about the willow, whose delicate nature is traditionally a symbol of women's beauty in East Asia. So this is a haiku about a willow. To tangle or untangle the willow, it's up to the wind. So moving on now to a Buddhist activist. Dosan was a Burmese lay Buddhist. She called herself both a feminist and a nationalist, and she was involved in the Burmese anti-colonial struggle. So at this time, when there was British colonial rule in Burma, so she was born in 1887. At this time, when there's British colonial rule in Burma, one of the consequences of that was increased education for women. So Dorsan did have a formal education as a girl, but her mother also wanted to augment that with some traditional Burmese schooling. So her mother taught her grammar, she taught her Burmese philosophy, history, poetry, and also she taught her Buddhist scriptures. So then Dorsan became one of a group of educated women who were also employed. And Dorsan set up and managed a newspaper, the Independent Weekly, which was published during the 1920s and 1930s. She was also a novelist and published many novels of her own. And she also wrote columns and articles for her newspaper, which were social and political commentary. She was a leading member of the Burmese Women's Association, which was established to protect and advance the intellectual and spiritual growth of women in Burma at the time. And she was a prolific writer, but still today she's not very well known outside of Burma. And a lot of her books are still not translated into any other language. Okay, so moving to Thailand now, and Maiji Khao Sianglang. So we know about Maiji Khao Sianglang from the work of Professor Martin Seeger at the University of Leeds. Martin Seeger has done a lot of work in Thailand, going around to different regions, and has discovered many Buddhist teachers and leading figures in different regions of Thailand who were women. So Maiji Khao Sianglang, here we have her statue and a memorial stupa to her. As we can see from this demonstrates something of her popularity. So these women that Martin studies were living in the 1800s and mostly the early 1900s. So Martin has gathered eyewitness testimony from disciples of hers that are still living, and also used other evidence he can find. There's a lot of funeral pamphlets that he's used. So as I say, you can see from all these attempts to honor her just what an influential teacher and leader she would have been. Martin's book also talks about many other Maiji teachers. So this is women who haven't been fully ordained, but have become nevertheless esteemed teachers in their region of Thailand. And then Kujo Takeko. So Kujo Takeko was, again, a Japanese Buddhist woman who achieved a great deal in her life. She began the Buddhist Women's Association, which continues today. She set that up with her sister-in-law in her early 20s. So this is part of Jojo Shinshu Buddhism. And there are still today many, this Buddhist Women's Association, we have many branches of around the world. So in the US, in Japan, Hawaii, South America, Canada. So still a very popular movement today. And part of what Kojo Takeko did with this movement was, this was part of the movement of and the beginning of women practicing in the Western world, as her Buddhist Women's Association started to move onto US soil, when we see Chinese migrant workers setting up Buddhist associations and Buddhist temples. Koji Dakeku was also a very well-known poet, again in Japan, not very well-known outside of Japan, but this is her best-known poet. And one of the things I did want to say, but I didn't remember to say, I think that whatever Buddhist tradition you're in, sometimes the words of teachers and the words of leaders can still resonate, even if these are not the words of teachers within your own tradition. So this is one of her best-known poems, and it's called Splendor of the Evening Sky. The beauty of the starlit sky. Who can understand this riddle? When countless eyes shine bright with tears of joy, my heart is at peace. There are Buddhas greater in number than the sands that line the Ganges River, who say, whether at noon or night, they will always protect me. My heart hears this and is at peace. So this has just been a brief introduction to some of the women in Buddhist history. And I'm going to start now. I'm going to stop talking and just click through a few more slides to show you a few more of these Buddhist women throughout history, and mostly in their own words. And this is to finish off the talk.
Alice, thank you very much indeed, and a wonderful moment of contemplation on those slides at the end. Um, Seeing the Tibetan woman, it reminds me of being in Kathmandu. And I should also say, Iselene Horner was born a stone's throw away from where we used to live in London. So I often used to think of her when we lived in northeast London. But look, that was an astonishing, wide-ranging international tour of the different modalities in which Buddhist women have followed the path. And really, you pointed to so many inspiring stories. I loved your alternative reply at the beginning, where the responses to the accusation of negativity, and it's always seemed really illogical to me that the Buddha broke through conventions and praised the spiritual potential of women and their different contributions to the community, saying that the community would not be complete without them. And I always felt there had to be some other reason for what could be read as negative, something around protection or discouraging perhaps male renunciants in being too interested in women. So that's really, really interesting. Before passing to Elizabeth, I really have one question. And it's about, I mean, the word liberation is often used in a Buddhist context. And I'm just wondering, obviously there is a spiritual sense of liberation, but do you also see a social sense of liberation, which Buddhism provided, allowing women in many societal contexts to achieve more than the constricting social norms might otherwise have allowed them to do?
Can I just make one thought? Sorry, Alice, could you switch off your You want me to stop PowerPoint? Sharing? Yes, please. Thank you. It'd be easier. Thank you.
So my question was really about the potentially constricting social norms in many societies, and whether actually not just a spiritual liberation, but a liberation from some of those constrictions which women in many societies so sadly have suffered. I would say, I think from my reading, I would say I don't actually get much of a sense of that. And I think that's because what I find in reading is, I want to call it the passion for Buddhism, although of course passion is not really the right word, but the devotion, the zeal, the desire for Buddhism to become nuns, to become renunciate women. So although I think that certainly, well, in some societies, you could say becoming a renunciate woman or becoming a Buddhist nun might allow you some freedoms that other women don't have. That's certainly not always the case, and maybe not even usually the case. So sometimes I think maybe that's part of it, but I don't get a general sense that that is much part of it. And I think that if that does happen, if there are some kind of social benefits or privileges, they come along, they're kind of a happenstance really for the women and not a reason for her to have made the choices she did. No, thank you. I was only thinking of various cases in the Tiragata where various people, whereas women actually managed to move out of, let's say, abusive family situations as a result. But look, I'm now going to turn to someone who knows a lot more than I do about all of this, namely Elizabeth Harris, Dr. Elizabeth Harris. She's joined us this afternoon, and I'm delighted she's with us. She's Senior Research Fellow in the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham, and also President of the UK Association for Buddhist Studies. And within Buddhist studies, Elizabeth has combined her interest in Theravada Buddhism with a real concern for contemporary issues. She spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka, and particularly looking at the question of faith against the background of conflict and interfaith relations. So I'm going to ask, before we have any questions, as it were, from the floor, I'm going to ask Dr. Elizabeth Harris if she can share some thoughts
In response to what Alice has been telling us, Elizabeth, are you there?
I'm there, I'm here,
Good.
and I can see you,
Floor is
Graham.
yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, I think I've been given at the outside 5 minutes. So just a few kind of comments and thoughts, and then a couple of questions, Alice. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I agree with you completely that the question of women in Buddhism cannot be reduced to a few negative passages in the Buddhist texts, or the difficulty within some Buddhist countries over the ordination of women. There's another incredibly positive story. And you have spent several decades uncovering it, I know. And I hope everyone noticed that there's quite a lot of research into ancient inscriptions in the talk that we've been given. And I know that's formed a part of what you've done in the last 20 years or so. And then moving forward in much more closer to the present. Yes, history is usually written by men, but it's a cliche to say there's also a her story as well. And Buddhism would not be what it is today, as you've said, without the narratives of women and what they've contributed. Now, I've lived in Sri Lanka, I've visited Thailand, and have done recent research in Myanmar. So before asking a couple of questions, I'd like to add a couple more women to the array of faces that you've given us, Alice. One from colonial Myanmar, and one or two more from contemporary Sri Lanka, because I noticed there weren't so many Sri Lankan women in your presentation. But, I've recently completed a biography of one of the first British men to become a Buddhist monk. He became Venerable Ananda Meitteya. But one of his main sponsors in Myanmar was Mei La Ung, or Dormya Mei, as she was known more colloquially. She was the only Burmese person mentioned in the social Burmese category in quite a prestigious book that was published in Burma at that time, a book connected with British imperial power, 20th Century Impressions of Burma. She established a society for the prevention of infant mortality, opened the Empress Victoria Buddhist Girls' School. She acted as patron for several Western men who became Buddhist monks and built a monastery for them, and was also a patron of a notable Burmese artist, Bamyan. She was the epitome of an independent, wealthy philanthropist. She also had a lot of sadness in her life. Her husband died when he was quite, well, middle-aged. You know, he didn't have him into her own old age. And her only child, her son, died quite early. But she, as an independent woman, continued and also gave money to the fledgling Buddhist Society of Great Britain and Ireland in London. I've been tracing that kind of history. It's fascinating. So another face. As for coming more to the present, Sri Lanka in the late 1980s and 1990s, when I was living there, I was working alongside a group of lay Buddhist women who were working tirelessly for the empowerment of Buddhist nuns in the country, the Silmanios or Dasa Silmatas, the 10 precept mothers, contemporary nuns who follow 10 precepts. One was Ranjani de Silva. After taking early retirement from a job as manager of human resources and administration within a state corporation, she joined the social service training section of an international Buddhist women's organization, Sakyadhita, that was established in 1987 in Bodh Gaya. And in this role, she first sought to help the Silmanios become more visible in the villages and in Sri Lankan society, in bringing the Dharma to families at village level. And she was also keen to train them in how to give social service to the people around them at a time of ethnic war and economic hardship. In 22, she helped to establish a Sakyadhita Center for training and meditation in Sri Lanka. And she also worked behind the scenes with quite a lot of Sri Lankan bhikkhus who supported bringing back higher ordination for women. But that's another story. She was an amazing woman whom I'm pleased to call a friend, although I lost contact with her when she was getting older. She moved to Australia, I think, to be with her daughter. Now, Ranjani faced opposition in her work from some other women and a good many more men. In 1997, I wrote an article that I called Reclaiming the Sacred, Buddhist Women in Sri Lanka. And what she and others were doing was kind of reclaiming the sacred for women in a situation where there was still quite a lot of patriarchy and resistance to this. So my question to you, Alice, concerns the wider context of patriarchy in society and within religions, not only Buddhism. It's there in Buddhism, but it's also there in other religions. So is there still a task for Buddhist women in challenging patriarchy within Buddhism and in wider society? And then if you believe there is, what needs to be done? How can Buddhism and Buddhist women contribute to this ongoing struggle against patriarchal structures?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. It is a good further contribution to what I was saying, to hear your thoughts and your experiences too. So patriarchy, I don't really like the word patriarchy, and not for the reasons that everybody would think. So as much as I understand the work of the French philosopher Foucault, who talks about power and dynamics of power in society, what I understand Foucault to be saying about power is that power doesn't really just exist as one kind of overarching aspect. In many societies, I suppose in authoritarian regimes, you would have much more of a top-down sense of power than in other types of societies. And as far as I understand Foucault, he talks about power as being something that kind of interweaves and interlinks, and there's different networks of power or power agency, people being empowered within within societies and within how societies work. So if we were to take, for instance, what is the basic unit of very many societies, which is a family, it could be the case that a woman, even in a society that was called a patriarchal society, a woman could have more power in the family than the wife could have more power than the husband in the family. So I think that if we understand power and agency and being empowered as working in a kind of dynamic way, or running through different aspects of society, and then I think there's something that we can all do in every kind of community or group that we're involved with, which would be always standing up for women, or standing up for ourselves, or standing up for other women, or finding ways, if we're women, to have power and agency in any of those communities. But I was going to say something else as well. But I think, and then with regard to Buddhism, I would say the kind of shift I would like to see is the sort of thing that I have been talking about, that now we're in this position where we do know more about the history of women, that we do start to center the history of women. And talk about that much more, and give that much more space and much more time, and just concentrate more on that, so that, you know, there are these questions still about female ordination, and there is still issues to do with women in a lot of Buddhist traditions. And I personally can't help thinking that if we did teach more of the teachings of Buddhist women, and the legacy of Buddhist women, that would actually start making a difference. I don't know what difference it would make, but I have a feeling that would start making a difference.
Alice, thank you for that. Liz, would you like to respond to that, or we can open?
I think we should open it out to other people. But yes, I agree with Alice. Yes, we just need to keep on talking and pressing and just, yes, being what we are, strong women.
Thank Thank you both. So starting with the questions from the floor, thank you for those of you putting these into the chat, really helpful. And this is probably the most efficient way of handling it rather than handing the floor to you, because that can get complicated. But I'll hopefully read your questions intelligently, and I know we'll get intelligent answers. So someone says, wonderful talk, Professor Collett. That's Stephen Bergfritz, and he says, given the long history of women's contributions to Buddhism, is there anything particularly distinctive about the role of women, about what women have experienced and contributed in the 20th and 21st centuries? So, you know, what the contemporary contribution of women, has it morphed, I suppose, to some extent?
I think that we are starting to see positive changes. So we are starting to see more women leaders, and women within different traditions taking on quite significant leadership roles. So being leaders of a particular abbot or particular temple or particular monastery or nunnery situation. So I think that's one change that we are beginning to see. And I think that can be, that's a reflection of the way that changes there have been in modern society, where it's just become, women have many more opportunities these days than they used to have. And I think the other thing I'd say about that is, I think there's still a lot more to discover. Like I said, for some of these women that I've been researching, we still don't have either enough translations, very good translations, or many translations, or much knowledge of them around the world. So yeah, I think on that as well, I'd say more work to do, and more discoveries to be made and more sharing. Yeah.
In some ways, of course, that's putting the clock in a positive way back. I always remember those wonderful lists from the Pali Canon. Many of you present will probably know exactly where, and I've forgotten, but in the Pali Canon, where you have lists of the accomplishments of both ordained and lay women, and they're long lists with their names given, who distinguish themselves in various ways. And I suppose society changes that it morphs the ways in which they're going to distinguish themselves, but actually that sense that that was really there at the beginning and not a new discovery.
Yeah, which is quite something, actually. And I've said this many times, in an ancient society of traditional values, it's quite something for these sorts of things to be recorded about women.
Yeah, extraordinary. Actually, wasn't there a French traveller to Burma, Myanmar, to Burma in the 17th century, who talked about he couldn't believe that the women in Burma could have property and run business. I mean, I forget the quote, but you know, it shows that we can look through this through various different lenses.
Yeah, yeah.
Moving on to another question, though I'm sure you and I, Alice, could discuss this all evening, but moving on to another question from the floor, there is an interesting one here which caught my eye about the role of women disciples, so a general term, of Buddha in spreading of the Buddha in spreading Buddhism. That comes from Sesam Namgyal. You know, I suppose we think of the men moving down the trade routes and mobility in terms of early spread of Buddhism, but I'll hand to you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one thing that I was thinking about what you just said, Graham, is there's also some of the reasons I think that these lives of these Buddhist women haven't taken center stage is because a lot of these Buddhist women are Asian women, and there certainly has been a perpetual idea of somehow it's Western women that have had feminism that hasn't happened in Asia, but that's very much an error to think like that. And actually, one thing I will say is I'm currently doing a paper with someone in the School of Classics here about the Achaemenid Empire, which is a Persian empire, existed at a similar time to which Buddhism began in India. And our paper is called Indian Travelers in the Achaemenid Empire. And one of those was an Indian woman. So that's even a pre-Buddhist Indian woman who was traveling in Persia. So yes, I think women were responsible for the spread of Buddhism. And in what I've been researching, we do find a lot of evidence of that, actually. And sometimes women worked really hard. There's one story, I can't even remember where it's from, I think it's from Burma, of a group of women who are trying to build their own nunnery, which they did. They built it themselves, but they didn't have any Buddhist teachers in the region they were in. So they would travel long distances to get their Buddhist teaching and then come back to their region and carry on building their monastery. So that's just one story of lots of stories that there are about women traveling and about women putting in effort, building temples and monasteries, converting locals, and really just spreading the Dharma.
There are a few here which actually maybe Liz would also be interested in this as these questions, which is about are there genuinely restrictions, let's call it that, on whether a woman can become a Buddha or enlightened, rebirth as a man first, this type of area. I mean, is that original? I mean, my question would be, is that original? Has it been added at some point by a more, say, chauvinist scribe or something? You know, I hand that one to you, but there are two questions from Nilmini Rulans and also from Francois Garcia on that.
Okay. So Bhikkhu Nalia has written an article on the, what's it called? The five, do you remember this? The five, not something like the five impossibilities for women or something, not exactly that, but one of them being about women becoming Buddhas. And he has compared the Pali sources with other sources and does argue that these ideas of the five impossibilities, I'm calling them now, I think he says he considers them to be a later edition. And there are actually different ideas within different traditions about whether, well, how can I put it? There's a lot of contradiction, I would say, in the Buddhist texts with regard to this issue. So some Buddhist texts might say that women can't become Buddhas, but then some Buddhist texts have women becoming Buddhas. So there's a Shrimala Sinha, what's it called? Shrimala. There's a Mahayana text about Shrimala, and people would argue that Shrimala is a Buddha or has become a Buddha. Jonathan Walters argues to do with, I think it's the Apadana Mahapajapati Gautami, that there's some way in which you can understand her as becoming something like a Buddha. One woman who I was going to put in my montage at the end, but I took out because I couldn't actually find any of her words, because she teaches Tibetan tantric Buddhism, which usually can be a secret transmission. There might still be some of her words, but anyway, she was mummified at the end of her life, and the idea is that she was mummified because she had attained Buddhahood. And that's a more modern example. So there are examples both in early texts and in Buddhist tradition of women that people think have achieved Buddhahood.
Actually, interestingly, although I can't remember where, I've read something about the Buddha and his wife over many, I mean, must be something in the Jatakas, I suppose, where the Buddha and his wife, it's like a joint striving for awakening that they have both gone through for many, many lifetimes, culminating, of course, in the one that is most familiar to us.
So Jonathan Walters writes about that in my
edited volume. Now I can't remember the name of my edited volume. Women in Early Indian Buddhism, Contemporary. No, what is it called? Women in Early Indian Buddhism. I can't remember. It's published in 2013. Do you remember, Liz? You're not in that one. I'm getting it mixed up with the recent one that we published. Anyway, so my 2013 volume, edited volume, but Jonathan Waters in that has a section on Abhidanas, and he talks about the wife of the Buddha, and he says there's a feminist edge to what we hear about the wife of the Buddha, along the lines of, you couldn't have done it without me.
Yeah, or alternative, it was a joint enterprise. Yeah, thank you. Just whilst we're in the similar area, this is a very historical one, and it almost has a yes. Sorry. Can someone mute, please? Sorry, we're getting a voice coming through. Amal, could you hit mute? Everyone should be muted. Can you please? I'll now unmute myself, and because I think I'm meant to be talking, and not someone else at the moment. So just return to this one. As I was going to say, it's almost a yes or no historical answer, which is about the monastic transmission, the female monastic transmission being interrupted potentially at some point in Sri Lanka. Is that a historical fact? Or, how did that happen? Or is it simply a claim made arising from some misogyny? But I'll deal with that one. It seems to be a very historical one, that one.
Okay. So, like I say, I'm not an expert on female ordination, but as far as I understand it, it was the 11th or 12th century in Sri Lanka. Is that right, Liz? And Buddhism was struggling generally, so both the monks and the nuns communities were struggling, but it was possible to continue the monks' ordination lineage, but not possible to continue the nuns' ordination lineage. This is the story anyway. We don't know if it's historical fact. It wasn't possible to continue the nuns' ordination lineage in the Theravada tradition. And so some nuns were brought over from Sri Lanka, from East Asia, is that right? From East Asia, maybe.
The story that I know is that for many centuries there was no order of bhikkhunis in Sri Lanka after the ordination was interrupted, probably because there were not enough bhikkhunis to order new ones. But there were still women who renounced, because some British, visitors to Sri Lanka mention women who renounced and are attached to temples and viharas. And then there was, the story is that kind of affluent Buddhist woman, Catherine de Alwis, went to Myanmar at the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century, because in Myanmar there was a 10-precept ordination of women, and she brought that ordination back to Sri Lanka, so that there grew up the order of Silmanios or Data Silmatas, or women who followed 10 precepts. And then towards the end of the 20th century, bhikkhuni ordination was brought back. A long story of some of the lay women that I mentioned, but it's still not, and although there are, I think, over 2,000, I was with a couple of bhikkhunis there just at the beginning of this year, and I think one of them said there was over 2,000 now women with higher ordination, but it's not accepted, it's not recognized by the state. I mean, it's accepted by many people, but it's not officially recognized by the state.
Liz, thank you for that. I'm going to ask, there's one more question, because there's someone who even had his hand up and therefore was very keen to ask, so we can't finish before this one. And then there's someone has put in a really nice question, which I think is a really good final question. So this is really your penultimate question, Alice, which is someone asking about the relationship between biological determinism and dependent arising. That's one I personally wouldn't like to answer, but you're better qualified than I.
Biological. So by biological determinism, I think that what you mean is that there are some aspects of being a woman and being a man that are determined by biology. Therefore, how does that? Oh, I see. So I think that you must be asking that in relation to what I said in terms of
Yes.
dependent arising.
Well, that's what I guessed at the beginning.
Okay. So
if
I
anyone
think
wants
so.
to add something in the chat, he or she, sorry, can, and we'd read that. But
Oh,
that,
no, I've got it now. So
yeah.
I think whatever we think of as biological determinism and whatever kind of parameters we set on that, I don't think any of those parameters will necessarily, I don't think any of those things that could come under biological determinism would stop human nature transforming into something that would make awakening possible. So, for example, I suppose we can take pregnancy. So pregnancy might involve a change of hormones, but then actually once a pregnancy is over, I think the hormones go back to the way that they were. And then I think that when I've read about biological determinism, there's some ideas that determinism might be related to somehow women wanting to nest and make a home, whereas men aren't so inclined to do that. And all of the things I can think of that I've ever read about biological determinism in terms of differences between men and women, I can't think of any that would not fall under what I was talking about with regard to dependent arising. So each of them still are an aspect of the human person that can be transformed on the path to awakening.
Yes, thank you. I think Kerry Fletcher has given you what I would, if I were doing this, I would love to have as a final question. So I think, thank you, Kerry, for the perfect final question. And it's got two parts, and I'll ask them one at a time, really. The first part is, what inspired you to follow this area of research, and what are you currently working on? That's Kerry Fletcher, part A.
Okay, there's a part B as well.
There is, but it's equally pleasant.
Okay. What led me to do the work I'm doing? Is that the first part of the question?
Yes.
Okay.
And what are you currently working on?
Okay, so I became interested in gender politics around probably age 8 or 9. My grandmother was a working class woman in London living in the 1940s and 50s. In the 1940s, with the war, women in London had a lot more opportunities to get into different work, etc., because of the war. And then she found, as we know, women were pushed back into a domestic life in the 1950s after the war. Because she was a working class woman, she didn't have many opportunities. And so when she saw things changing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, she would constantly say to us, her grandchildren, don't ever let anyone tell you can't do something just because you're a girl. Now, when I started off, when I decided I wanted to study Buddhism for my PhD, I didn't study gender first of all, but then I happened to start reading about gender in Buddhism and reading stories about women in Buddhism. And I felt like I found lots of women who had a grandmother like me, lots of women who didn't let limitations stop them. So that's kind of how I got into it. I think that's why my interest is in this, in uncovering these kind of stories, I would say. And one thing I'm working on now is a project which is an online encyclopedia. And it's an encyclopedia of kind of Buddhist thought and practice. And we're having lots of, I'm commissioning currently lots of entries on Buddhist teachers. So I'm trying to include lots of female teachers in that. And the encyclopedia entries are 10,000 words. So I'm hoping to commission and then publish
lots of online articles suitable for a range of audiences, for practitioners, students and scholars, about women teachers in Buddhism and their teachings and their legacy.
Sounds wonderful. Kerry Fletcher B is, you may already have answered, which is, what do you think would be fruitful areas for future research?
Fruitful areas, good areas for future research. I mean, yes, just more on uncovering the lives of these Buddhist women in history, I think. Yeah. Or actually even modern Buddhist women in other countries, modern Buddhist women in Sri Lanka or Thailand or Burma, who are well-known teachers in their area, but their work never gets translated. So translating some of the work of some of these wonderful modern teachers so that they're more known to the world.
Wonderful. Alice, thank you very much. And Elizabeth, thank you very much as well. When I was thinking how to finish this, I thought I wouldn't actually finish with my own words, because I really can't do better than finishing with Alice's words, which I was reading just the other day. And they're, can I say they're beautiful? I think I'm allowed to say that. Beautiful words with probably which to finish and to sum up. So, with the many challenges we face in the modern world, such as environmental disasters, deadly viruses, and dangerous political figures, coming together and realizing our shared humanity is just as important now as it has always been. If and when men and women can work together and create community, good can come out of that. When we experience hope and love that is moving, fluid, endless, and a morality that envisages us as inseparable from all things, we go some way towards achieving what the Buddha ordained. Thank you. And thank all of you, and I will hand back for more formal thanks to Amal. Thank you very much. You're muted, Amal.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again to Graham for actually facilitating today's engagement. And thank you, obviously, as ever, to Professor Alice Collett for that really inspiring and informative talk. It has really been very informative, and I think from the messages I can see, it has been very well appreciated. I'd like to formally end today's event and discussion by also thanking the very many people who've joined us today. Without you, I think this wouldn't have been an event. And also for asking some very interesting questions. So thank you for tuning in. It has been, there are, I know, lots of other competing things happening today. And the weather's looking great as well. So thank you for actually joining us on Zoom today. This event wouldn't have happened without the collaboration of Graham Dixon, and as well to Dr. Elizabeth Harris. And I must sincerely thank them for their participation. I know that behind the scenes they have been making preparations for today, and I'm very grateful. Let me just say a few words about our future plans. So we are, British Mahabodhi Society is planning on an excursion and a tour of the British Museum in May of the Amaravati exhibitions. So that will be obviously a physical event. And obviously it'll be open to everyone, but I guess our international audiences will find that difficult to attend. But nevertheless, we will try and disseminate some of that information out to everyone. I'd also like to just add to the comment. I noticed that Sudhanta Abekun has mentioned that this is an area, this topic today of women in Buddhism is something that needs to be returned to from time to time. And I propose to have some other speakers as well to discuss this area and other aspects of it. One thing that has caught my attention is a film possibly an activist film really called Bhikkhuni, which explores the area of ordination for women. I have been in touch with the director and producer of that film to see whether it is possible to arrange for a screening at London Buddhist Vihara at some point. Okay, formally, I'd like to also obviously thank my co-directors at the British Mahabodhi Society, especially the trustees of the Anagarika Dhammapala Trust, who we are under, and in particular to Sudhamika Hevavithana, the chairman, Rajiv Hevavithana, and Singha Ratnatunga, who have always been supportive towards the British Mahabodhi Society and its revival over the last 18 months or so. And I'd like to also thank my colleagues in London, Sudhanta Abekun and Dr. Nihal Veerasena for their support and guidance. Okay, and may I also now take the opportunity of wishing you all happy Singhala and Tamil New Year, which is happening today as we speak. Subha Arutakdweva. Thank you so much. Thank you and see you soon.
Thank you.